August 4th, 1962. One of the most famous women on earth sat alone inside her home in Brentwood, California. By the following morning, she would be dead. The official verdict has remained the same for decades. A probable suicide caused by an overdose of sleeping tablets. But more than 60 years later, people are still asking the same questions. Was it really that simple? Or did the world's biggest movie star take secrets to her grave? Tonight, we're going back to the beginning. Not to prove a conspiracy, but to separate fact from fiction. Because when it comes to Marilyn Monroe, the truth may be stranger than the rumors. Welcome to Patterned Reality. Before she was Marilyn Monroe, she was a little girl named Norma Jeane Mortensen, born on June 1st, 1926 in Los Angeles. From the very beginning, life was anything but glamorous. Her father has never been confirmed. Her birth certificate listed one man, Edward Mortensen, but most historians believe he wasn't actually her biological father. It's a mystery that followed her throughout her life. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, struggled with severe mental health problems and was unable to care for her consistently. That meant Norma Jeane spent much of her childhood moving between foster homes and an orphanage. Imagine never really knowing where you belonged. Never knowing if you'd be staying somewhere for weeks or years. That feeling of wanting to be loved would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she grew older, things didn't get much easier. Several biographers have reported that Marilyn later described experiences of abuse and neglect while living in some foster homes. Some details remain disputed, but there is broad agreement that her childhood was deeply unstable and traumatic. By the age of 16, she faced another heartbreaking choice. Either return to the orphanage or get married. She chose marriage. In 1942, she married James Dougherty. It wasn't the fairy tale people imagine. It was survival. While her husband served overseas during the war, Norma Jeane took a job in a factory helping the war effort. That's where everything changed. A military photographer named David Conover visited the factory to photograph women supporting wartime production. One of those women stood out immediately. Norma Jeane. She had a natural smile, confidence in front of the camera, and a look that photographers couldn't ignore. Soon she left factory work behind and began modeling full-time. She straightened her hair, dyed it blonde, learned how to pose, and within a remarkably short time she was appearing on magazine covers across America. The little girl who never felt she belonged was suddenly being seen by millions. In 1946, everything changed again. She signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox. The studio wanted a new name. Norma Jeane became Marilyn Monroe. It wasn't just a name change. It was the creation of a brand. Studios carefully controlled almost every part of a star's public image, from hairstyles and clothing to interviews and publicity. Marilyn worked relentlessly to improve her acting, studying the craft while building a career in Hollywood. Within a few years, she became one of the most recognizable faces on earth. The smile, the blonde hair, the white dress, the glamorous image. The world thought they'd found the perfect movie star. But behind the cameras, the insecurities from her childhood never truly disappeared. And as her fame grew, so did the pressure. To the world, Marilyn Monroe had everything. Money, beauty, fame, power. But behind closed doors, her marriages were failing. Her mental health was fragile. She was taking increasing amounts of medication. And before long, she would find herself surrounded by some of the most powerful and dangerous people in America. By the early 1950s, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just becoming famous. She was becoming a phenomenon. Films like Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire turned her into one of the biggest stars on the planet. The blonde hair, the breathy voice, the glamorous dresses. Hollywood had created the perfect image. But there was a problem. Marilyn was far more intelligent and ambitious than the image the studios had built around her. And she was beginning to hate being treated like a product. Because behind that famous smile, things were already starting to crack. In 1954, Marilyn married one of the most famous sportsmen in America, baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. To the public, they looked perfect. America's biggest movie star, married to one of America's biggest sporting heroes. But behind closed doors, the relationship was troubled. DiMaggio was reportedly deeply uncomfortable with Marilyn's public sex symbol image. And then came one of the most famous moments in Hollywood history. The white dress, the subway grate. Marilyn standing above it as her skirt blew into the air, while crowds watched and photographers snapped away. The scene became iconic. But according to multiple accounts, DiMaggio was furious. Their marriage lasted just 9 months. Marilyn later spoke publicly about what she described as mental cruelty. The fairy tale was over almost as quickly as it had begun. And then Marilyn did something Hollywood wasn't expecting. She fought back. She was tired of being underpaid, tired of being typecast, and tired of being treated as though she should simply smile, look beautiful, and do as she was told. So she left Hollywood, moved to New York, and formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. Today, a major star starting their own company might not sound unusual. But in the 1950s, for a woman under the control of the studio system, it was a bold move. She also began studying acting more seriously, determined to prove she was more than the character Hollywood had created. And eventually, the studio gave in. Marilyn returned with a better contract, more money, and more creative control. The woman many people dismissed as a dumb blonde had just taken on one of Hollywood's biggest studios, and won. Then came Arthur Miller, a celebrated playwright, an intellectual, and on the surface, almost the complete opposite of Joe DiMaggio. Marilyn seemed to want something different now. Not just passion, not just fame, but stability, respect, a home. They married in 1956. For a while, it looked as though Marilyn had finally found the life she'd been searching for. But again, the happiness didn't last. Their relationship became strained. Marilyn suffered devastating personal losses, including miscarriages and an ectopic pregnancy. At the same time, her dependence on prescription medication was becoming increasingly serious. Sleeping pills, sedatives, medication to wake up, medication to calm down, and all while the pressure of being Marilyn Monroe continued every single day. By the time she filmed The Misfits, her marriage to Miller was collapsing. They divorced in 1961. Another relationship gone, another dream broken, and Marilyn was becoming increasingly vulnerable. By the early 1960s, there were effectively two Marilyns. There was the Marilyn the public saw, beautiful, smiling, untouchable. And then there was the woman behind the image, struggling with insomnia, struggling with anxiety, struggling with relationships, and increasingly dependent on doctors and prescription medication. Her work became more difficult. She was often late to film sets. Sometimes she didn't arrive at all. Studios complained. The press mocked her. And the very industry that had helped create Marilyn Monroe was now beginning to describe her as a problem. But then, another chapter began. And this is where the story becomes far more controversial, because Marilyn Monroe was no longer simply mixing with actors and movie stars. She was moving close to political power. Very close. For decades, rumors have surrounded Marilyn Monroe's relationship with President John F. Kennedy. Some claims are well documented. Others remain disputed, and that's important. Because when it comes to Marilyn and the Kennedys, Fact and legend have become almost impossible to separate. Marilyn moved in social circles that overlapped with powerful political figures, including people close to the Kennedy family. And on the 19th of May, 1962, she walked onto a stage at Madison Square Garden, wearing a skin-tight, crystal-covered dress, and sang 4 words that would become part of history. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." The performance was playful, intimate, and instantly controversial. Millions of people have watched that footage since, and because of the rumors already surrounding Marilyn and JFK, the moment took on a life of its own. But the story didn't stop with JFK. Because over the years, claims also emerged linking Marilyn to his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Again, some of those claims remain heavily disputed. But if Marilyn really was close to men at the very top of the American government, then a disturbing question appears. What might she have heard? By 1962, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a movie star. She was a global icon, moving through circles filled with politicians, millionaires, Hollywood executives, and some of the most powerful men in America. And there was something else. The FBI had a file on her. Her political connections had attracted attention. Her private life was becoming increasingly chaotic. Her relationship with the studio was collapsing. And just weeks after that famous birthday performance, Marilyn Monroe would be dead, 36 years old, found in her bedroom, a telephone nearby, prescription bottles beside the bed. And almost immediately, questions began. Questions about the timeline. Questions about missing evidence. Questions about who visited her that night. And questions about whether the official story really explained everything. Because the final hours of Marilyn Monroe's life may be the strangest part of the entire story. Saturday, August the 4th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old. She was living in a modest Spanish-style home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. And despite the image many people have of her final days, Marilyn's life was not simply over. She had been fired from the film Something's Got to Give after repeated absences. But there had been discussions around bringing her back. She had recently taken part in a major photo shoot. And according to people around her, she was still making plans. But by the following morning, Marilyn Monroe would be dead. And more than 60 years later, the exact sequence of events during those final hours is still debated. Because this story doesn't begin with a body. It begins with phone calls. During the evening, Marilyn reportedly spoke to several people by telephone. One of the most important was Peter Lawford, an actor, a member of the Kennedy family's social circle, and the brother-in-law of President John F. Kennedy. Lawford later said Marilyn sounded strange, slurred, drowsy, and during one call, he claimed she said words that have since become famous. Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. But there's a problem. Like so much of this story, accounts differ. The exact wording, the exact timing, and even the sequence of some calls have been debated for decades. Still, Lawford reportedly became worried. He tried to call her back, and when he couldn't reach her, concern began to grow. What happened next depends on whose timeline you believe. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was staying at the property that night. And this is where the official account becomes crucial. According to the story later given to authorities, Murray woke during the early hours of August the 5th. She noticed something unusual. Marilyn's bedroom light was still on. The door was locked. And Marilyn wasn't responding. Murray then contacted Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. Greenson arrived at the house, looked through a bedroom window, and saw Marilyn lying motionless on the bed. He reportedly broke a window to get inside. Marilyn was dead. But this raises the question that has haunted the case ever since. When exactly was she found? Police were notified at around 4:25 in the morning. That is one of the key times in the official record. But investigators later questioned why there appeared to be a delay between the discovery of Marilyn's body and the call to police. Exactly how long that delay was depends on which account you follow. And over the years, the timeline became even more confusing. Eunice Murray gave accounts that were seen by critics as inconsistent. At one point, she suggested she had been doing laundry during the night. Other details appeared to shift. And decades later, in a filmed interview, Murray made a statement that poured even more fuel onto the mystery. She suggested that Robert Kennedy had been at Marilyn's home on the day she died. That claim has never been conclusively proven. But once she said it, the entire case became even more controversial. Inside the bedroom, police found Marilyn lying face down across the bed. She was unclothed. A telephone receiver was reportedly in her hand or close beside her. Medication containers were found in the room. The official conclusion would eventually be that she died from acute barbiturate poisoning. Her death was classified as a probable suicide. Not simply suicide, probable suicide. And that wording matters, because the investigators who reviewed the death believed the evidence pointed strongly toward intentional overdose. But the circumstances were not witnessed. There was no single piece of evidence showing exactly what Marilyn had intended. And then came the toxicology questions. Then we come to one of the most repeated claims in the Marilyn Monroe mystery, the missing diary. For decades, stories have circulated that Marilyn kept a small diary, sometimes described as red, containing private notes about powerful people, the Kennedys, political conversations, secrets she may have heard. But here is the important part. The existence and contents of this supposed diary have never been conclusively established. There are claims, there are witness stories, there are books, but no verified diary has ever emerged proving that Marilyn was recording state secrets. And yet, the story refuses to disappear. There were also long-running questions about telephone records, the handling of evidence, and whether every person connected to Marilyn's final hours was properly investigated. Some claims are credible questions, others are speculation. And over time, the two have become tangled together. And hanging over everything were the Kennedys. Marilyn's connection to John F. Kennedy has been discussed for decades. Claims about Robert Kennedy are even more controversial. Some writers and witnesses allege that Robert Kennedy visited Marilyn in California around the time of her death. Others dispute those stories completely. There is no conclusive public proof that either Kennedy brother ordered Marilyn's death. None. And that needs to be said clearly. But Marilyn's closeness to powerful political circles, combined with the Cold War, FBI interest, rumors about organized crime, and her sudden death at just 36, created the perfect conditions for suspicion. Because if Marilyn knew nothing dangerous, then perhaps her death was exactly what the official investigation suggested. A vulnerable woman, struggling with medication, who took a fatal overdose. But if she did know something, then the question becomes very different. The official conclusion was probable suicide. Marilyn Monroe was buried on August the 8th, 1962. Joe DiMaggio, the former husband who had never completely disappeared from her life, helped arrange the funeral. Hollywood executives were largely kept away. So were many of the famous people who had surrounded Marilyn during her life. And according to widely repeated accounts, DiMaggio continued sending roses to her crypt for years afterwards. The most photographed woman in the world was gone. But the questions were only beginning. Because 2 decades later, Los Angeles authorities would take another look at the case. And what they found did not officially overturn the original conclusion. But it revealed just how many strange claims, contradictions, and unanswered questions had gathered around Marilyn's death. Was it suicide? An accidental overdose? A medical disaster? A cover-up? Or murder? And more importantly, which parts of the conspiracy story are actually backed by evidence? So, what really happened to Marilyn Monroe? The truth is, we still don't know. The official ruling was probable suicide. And no, there is no conclusive proof that Marilyn was murdered. Not by the Kennedys. Not by the CIA. Not by the FBI. Not by the mob. But absence of proof doesn't erase the questions. A disputed timeline, changing accounts, questions over when she was actually found, and why police weren't called sooner. A woman connected to some of the most powerful men in America, dead at just 36. Marilyn most likely died in a dangerous world of prescription drugs. But whether that final overdose was deliberate, accidental, or something else, may never be known. And maybe that's the real tragedy. The world spent decades trying to uncover what happened to Marilyn Monroe, while forgetting the woman underneath, Norma Jeane. We cannot prove she was murdered, but more than 60 years later, we still cannot prove we were told the whole story. Thank you so much for watching, and for being part of Patterned Reality. Now tell me what you think. Suicide, accident, or something else? Drop your verdict below. And remember, once a conspiracy is proven, it's no longer a conspiracy theory. It becomes fact.